So interestingly enough, I actually earlier this year, I was invited to speak at the Dubai International Project Management Forum. And I was just astounded that they found me somehow. And this is a variant. It's actually a longer form of that presentation. So I hope you enjoy it. And as I go through, we're a small enough group. If you have questions, put your hand up or put your question in the chat. I'm happy to go as handle those as we go along. So, before we get started, I have a small confession to make, which is I don't like the word hybrid. And my dislike of the word hybrid really has nothing to do with project management. It actually has to do with bicycles. So about 30 years ago, my son was born. At the time, I was doing racing triathlons. And I wanted to, I got one of these burly carts so I could pull him behind my bike with me. And, I had a problem because here I had my triathlon bike, which was fast, it was sleek, it was cool. And having a triathlon bike is like having a sports car. You're not going to put a burly behind that. So I was talking to one of my buddies who was also a big cyclist. He said, well, Alan, you could get yourself a mountain bike. Having a mountain bike, it's rough, it's rugged, it's like having a Jeep. It's pretty cool too. So, but if you get a hybrid bike, it's like driving a Prius. There's just nothing cool about that whatsoever. So of course, I bought myself a mountain bike to go with my my road bike, my race bike. And so, my first big takeaway, or the first big takeaway from this presentation is that as project managers, we should focus on being pragmatic rather than being cool. We should do the things that make sense, that work on our projects. So when we look at the data in terms of our project success, not that great. And this is data from the 2021 PMI Pulse of the Profession report. 3/4 of the projects met the business intent, about 10 to 15%. And this is traditional, fail outright. And then, most of our projects, about half of our projects, either are over budget or late. And another interesting fact, and this came out of the 2024 report, is that there's not a whole lot of difference in terms of the project performance between our different frameworks or our different methodologies. So what I want to talk about today is, the art of hybrid project management or intentional hybrid project management. And I made the hybrid small because as we go through, I'll share my view, which is really pretty much all of our projects are hybrid. And really what we want to focus on is the intentionality that we bring to managing and leading our efforts. So definitionally, intentional means we're being deliberate, we're being thoughtful, we're making choices that make sense. And the definition for hybrid, and this is both just a general definition for hybrid, but it really also applies to project management, is that we're using a combination of different elements or different styles. It's a mixture. So in my view, hybrid was not a thing in project management really until about 2019 when PMI announced that they were going to be changing the face of the PMP exam. And 1/4 of our questions were going to be hybrid and another 1/4 of the questions were going to be agile. And if you looked at the Google search trends back then, everybody was interested in agile, myself included. And basically nobody really cared that much about hybrid. But what really caught my attention was that when PMI introduced or released its 2024 PMP Pulse of the Profession report, hybrid jumped into second place over agile and slightly behind predictive as a project management approach. And what we also saw is that the interest in hybrid project management grew tremendously, basically doubled, from a search perspective over that time period. So when I saw the Pulse of the Profession report, I got really interested in hybrid, and I wrote 4 different articles that I had published up on my website about hybrid project management, because I figured, okay, this is something we need to think about. And then as I was preparing for the presentation, also wrote an article about intentional project management. And so one of my basic premises here is that when we look at it, pretty much all of our projects are hybrid, our second big takeaway. So we know what predictive looks like, the characteristics of predictive, our big upfront planning, delivery at the end, our top-down management structures, and our predictive project management approaches really came from construction, from big DoD projects. In fact, a lot of the tools that we use, PERT charts and things like that, really were developed as part of the Poseidon submarine and missile program back in the 50s. So, we all believe that we know what predictive looks like. We know the cascading waterfall. For those of us that have actually dug into it a little bit, that was the picture that Winston Royce included in his seminal article in 1970 in the Journal of the IEEE. And he called it waterfall because it just looked like this beautiful cascading array of project phases. Interestingly enough, though, not that many people turned past the second or third page in the article, because Royce then talked about how that waterfall predictive approach actually introduced a lot of risk on our projects because there wasn't feedback loops. And so when you start building or including those feedback loops that he discussed, there were a lot of them. And all of a sudden, that beautiful cascade feels a lot like what we talk about today on our Agile projects. So most of us here, obviously, since this is Loud and Agile Network, know what Agile looks like. And to my mind, really the 2 key components of Agile are iterative and incremental delivery, along with our empowered self-managing teams. Agile, as we all know, came from software, but Agile actually applies very well to a lot of knowledge work projects. I teach classes pretty regularly at NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and when I start talking about Agile, and these are folks that are scientists that are much smarter than me, they're like, oh, this is just the scientific method being applied to business problems. And I'm like, you're right. So when we think about Agile, Agile is not a methodology. Agile is not a single framework. There's a friend of mine counted it up. There's over 35 different Agile certifying bodies. There's, dozens of different frameworks out there. And Agile is really just a statement of values and principles. And those frameworks, those methodologies, the toolkits are ways of hopefully enabling our agility. And so people talk about a project management spectrum, this linear path. And in fact, if you look at the PMI's work, they talk about this linear path. We've got our predictive on one side, we've got our Agile on the other side, and this whole area in the middle is just hybrid. And I think that view is actually very simplistic, because it really leaves out lean and Kanban. Lean and Kanban practices are things that we can meld into all of our projects. As we all know, lean was developed by Toyota as part of the lean manufacturing process, a way of managing the flow of inventory. And Kanban is a great way of managing the flow of work basically anywhere. It can be through the inventory through a factory. Our Agile teams use it, we call our Scrum boards. And it also fits into, it has literally 1,001 practical uses. Several years ago, I was listening to a podcast, and someone was talking about how she set up a Kanban board at Thanksgiving for her kids to actually set up the Thanksgiving table. And so when we talk about lean, lean is also defined as a set of principles. We're focusing on delivering value, eliminating waste, and very importantly, continuously improving. So I believe that rather than thinking about project management as this just sort of one-dimensional continuum, that really we should think about it as a palette. And that this palette is a way for us as project managers to combine the appropriate practices and tools and ways of working, just as an artist blends paints and blends colors in order to make beautiful pictures. So rather than coming up with this very linear or binary view of the world, I think we should begin to think of things in terms of hybrid as projects that are hybrid but lean more towards the predictive side of the spectrum, or projects that are hybrid that lean a little bit more towards the agile side. And we see these types of patterns out in the wild. If we talk about our hybrid predictive, the construction industry has been practicing that since the 70s when they're using design build. The traditional way of building a large building is you hire your architect and your engineers, they come up with the design, you bid it out, and you have someone else come in and build it. But what we found is that, or what the industry found, is that was risky. There was a lot of information that gets lost between the design side and the build side. It takes more time. There's an increase in cost. And so the construction industry has actually moved more towards this design build way of working, where you hire a single firm that's responsible for managing the overall development effort. Even in the 70s, when everybody was talking about our waterfall approach, lots of organizations were doing joint application development for software. We'll bring our developers and our users, our customers together to co-create the solution. And it was much more effective because we could have those important conversations. We also see out in the wild where we have, predictive projects where we're beginning to embed our lean agile practices, like building flow in, and it's easy to use Kanban or other things within a predictive project. Another part that's important that we can even build into our predictive projects is customer centricity, using UX and UI, even within that overall predictive framework. Probably all of us have encountered, the hybrid agile world. And when I'm doing consulting, I run into this all the time. I've got people that say, oh, I'm doing an agile project, but we have a fixed set of requirements. We have a federal client, or we need to make sure that all of these features are built into the system. We're agile, but we're in an organization that still has a very traditional top-down command and control management approach. Or rather than having our dedicated self-organizing teams, we have matrix delivery teams. So we have people that are supporting multiple projects. We've got partial resource allocations. Or we have non-agile roles. We have managers in the role of the scrum master, or the product owner is the business analyst from the technology side, because no one from the business wanted to take that role. And so when you think about it, these are very common patterns in terms of what we see with our projects and how our projects are organized, right? So my third takeaway for all of you is, rather than thinking about project management in this very binary world of predictive versus agile, Hatfields versus McCoys, we really should think about the various patterns of practice. So one of the ways I like to think about what type of approach makes sense is to look at the cost of change versus the clarity of needs. And so when the cost of change is high and our clarity of needs is high, our predictive approach makes sense. If we're building a building, we want to make sure that we have very clear requirements before we start digging, excavating basements and pouring concrete, because the cost of change is very high. Where the cost of change is very low and the clarity of our needs is uncertain, our continuous delivery or our agile Scrum approaches work very well, because we're able to get feedback as we develop things. And the cost of making updates at that point is minimal. To me, Kanban is a set of practices that work well embedded within either of those two environments. It helps us manage the flow of work. It helps create visibility and transparency into what we're doing. So there's other ways of thinking about what approach makes sense. One of them is the adapted Stacey model. Ralph Stacey began to think about problems and problem spaces, and he defined our problems as being simple, complicated, or complex. Our simple problems require, we're just happy with a linear approach. So our predictive project approaches fit very well there. If we're making enhancements or modifications to an existing system, we know what we need to do. We add another column to the report, change the calculation, boom, easy. We don't need to get very involved in the overhead of being agile. Our complicated problems are problems where we can disaggregate the problem, solve each of those problems, and then aggregate the solution, and everything works. And there, in our complicated problems, our agile or our hybrid approaches work very well. But when we're looking at our complex problems where we cannot predict the interactions or where there's many unknowns, agile really predominates, or modified hybrid techniques predominate, because we're able to build, get feedback, use that feedback to drive forward. Any questions? Professor Nitro Rodriguez, who actually developed the Harvard Business School's Project Management Handbook, about a year ago came up with a different model of thinking about when should projects be agile versus waterfall or hybrid. And so he came up with this model where you would score, the scope certainty, the change adaptability, stakeholder engagement, the delivery time frame, and the risk complexity. You score everything up. And then based on that, he said, well, this part of the project or this phase of the project should be waterfall, hybrid, or agile. Another way of thinking about it, in terms of picking our project approach, is the discipline agile decision tree. And so if you go out to the Discipline Agile website or the PMI website for Discipline Agile, you'll see this decision tree. And DA is actually methodology or framework agnostic, and it recognizes that there's times where we might want to have a serial or waterfall approach, or we want to use Scrum or their Scrum-like process, or flow-based Agile, or for really high-performing teams, where we want to go to a continuous delivery process. And so the reason I show these different models and these different ways of thinking about it is there's not a clear consensus about how we should begin to structure or think about hybrid. And I think that's fine. I think that one of the problems that we've run into is that we've tried to be, too predictive with our approaches, and we need to be able to think about our problems and our solution space multiple different ways. So when we start looking at hybrid, there's lots of different patterns that may emerge. One common pattern is water scrum fall, where we're going to do our more predictive planning, and then maybe we will do a Scrum or a Scrum-like process for our development, but then we deliver everything all at once. We could also have a Scrum fall-like process. And this is where, when we're doing our development, some parts of our development may follow more of a predictive waterfall approach, and other parts of the project may follow a more Scrum or iterative approach. When Microsoft was developing Windows 10, they used this Scrum fall-like approach. They used a waterfall-like approach for developing the infrastructure of the operating system, but then they used an iterative and incremental approach for building the user interface. And then there's just where people are doing their mixing and matching, across the different organizations. It might be that we've got a very plan-driven or waterfall or traditional way of managing or planning our projects, or maybe we're using a lean portfolio management approach to our planning. Maybe we're mixing our Scrum, our predictive, and our Kanban approaches, and we're deploying anywhere from on a predictive life cycle to a continuous delivery life cycle. And we see some of those types of approaches in a lot of the companies and a lot of the organizations we work with as well. Any questions? Comments? So one of my clients these days is one of the big aerospace defense contractors. And there I'm usually teaching portfolio management classes to senior folks that are running huge, hundreds of millions of dollars or billion-dollar portfolios. And the VP of project management capabilities will often come in as a guest speaker. And I stole this slide from her with permission, because I thought it was just a brilliant way of describing the worlds that we live in. And she says, I've never seen a project fail for something new. You, as the project manager, the portfolio manager, the program manager, may not know the mode of failure, but someone you know does. And when you think about it, or when I think about it, this really rings out very true. Rarely have I seen a project that crashed and burned and I'm like, damn, I've never seen that before. We know the things that are going to be problems, and quite often we ignore them. We put our heads in the sand. We pray that nothing bad will happen, that none of the risks that we've identified will materialize, and then we're like, oh, I can't believe we ran into a problem, but we really should have known. Any questions or comments? I see something in the chat. So that takes me to my fourth takeaway, my fourth principle here, which is, to be successful, we want to be intentional. And so when you look at the Discipline Agile framework, DA includes a set of principles, and I really love the DA principles. Three of those principles are context counts. Every project, every team, Every organization is unique. And as project managers or agilists or whoever we are, we need to understand the context of the project that we're executing and then make choices accordingly. So DA also talks about how choice is good. The more we understand different frameworks, different toolkits, different sets of practices, the better we are as project managers, as agilists, at making those right informed choices. And finally, we want to be pragmatic. We want to pick the practices, the approaches, the tools that make sense for this project. So what does that mean? When we pull this all together, we start talking about intentional project management. It's like, Alan, that all sounds great. It sounds like mom and apple pie. I'll buy 5 of them. But how do I enable this? So I think one of the real fundamental things we need to do at the very beginning of our projects is ask the what and the why. And it's what are we doing and why are we doing it? And Peter Drucker, well, both Peter Drucker and Simon Sinek, 2 of my favorites, really tried to drill these 2 foundational fundamental questions into their audiences. Drucker would ask people, what business are you in? What is it that you're trying to achieve? And Simon Sinek talks about the value of starting with the why, that really, truly great companies aren't just producing products, they're getting people to buy into their vision. And that's what really differentiates them. And one of the companies he frequently talks about is Apple. There's nothing that really differentiates an iPhone. Why should I buy an iPhone from Apple versus a Google phone? Or why is it that if you look around my house, I've got an iPad, a Mac Mini? It's because they're good. They make amazing products and people buy into that infrastructure. So as we're starting off, what are we doing and why are we doing it? One of the articles, actually the article I just published this month, actually talked about that we want to understand the what and the why before we begin our projects. The other thing, or the next thing I think we need to do, is rather than trying to create things out of whole earth or whole silk, whole cloth, leverage existing bodies of knowledge. There's a ton of different choices out there. We've got the PMBOK, we've got information from PMI, there's Prince, there's IPMA, there's Scrum, there's Scaled Agile, there's Discipline Agile, and I'm barely scratching the surface. The more we know, the more we understand different methodologies and frameworks and toolkits, the better we are at making informed choices. As Isaac Newton said, I stand on the shoulders of giants. As project managers, we can do the same. So as if I needed to convince you of this, one of the pieces of data is that our maturity matters. The higher our maturity in terms of our skills and our knowledge, the more likely we are to be successful. The more likely we are to deliver projects that meet our business intent, as well as our schedule and our cost expectations. So our next big takeaway, make intentional choices. Rather than being locked into, well, this is the framework, or this is the methodology, or this is what whoever says, make choices based on what works. Be pragmatic, tying back to my first big takeaway. Another thing that we want to do to be successful is to measure and track our performance. It sounds pretty intuitive, pretty simple, pretty basic. However, it's really interesting. About a year ago, or actually it'll be about a year ago in September, PMI published some new research on project success. And what they looked at was a different measure of success. And they came up with a net project success score, which is essentially a net promoter score. And what they found is if we define our success criteria up front, we establish a system for measuring our project performance, and we track the performance, it increases the net project success score sevenfold. Sevenfold. These are basic things. And think of how many projects we know aren't doing it. Our next step is we want to improve continuously. Use the Deming or a Deming-like cycle. Plan the work, execute it, capture some metrics, study it, check, and then adjust or act. Agile's been doing this forever. That's the whole reason we have retrospectives. But make your retrospectives valuable, make them insightful, force people to think about what can we do to make things better. So I think some of the foundational elements that we need in any project, and these are both some of the things in terms of artifacts as well as ways of as well as practices, are, first of all, we need to have a project charter or some kind of document that initiates our project. A couple months ago, I finished reading a book about Amazon. And if anybody that's familiar with Amazon, Amazon is famous for its 6-page memos or its memos. And at first I was very, very dubious about this. Like, why this whole thing with memos? We've pretty much everybody else has stopped writing anything longer than an email ages ago, and everything's in PowerPoint. And what they said, and it's true, because I see it when I write my articles. It's really easy to be fast and slick and just gloss over details in PowerPoint. But when you put pen to paper, figuratively, and write things out long form and get feedback on it, it really forces us to think. It forces us to think through the details. And the purpose of the charter is to create a document where we've clearly defined what we're going to do, why we're going to do it, what are the challenges that we face, and very importantly, what's going to be our acceptance criteria or our success criteria. Another document that I think we need to be creating is a project management plan. And I don't care what you call it, but the project management plan is there for us as the project leaders. And I don't care if we're doing Scrum or traditional, but it's a way for us to define how we're going to execute the project. And again, that process of thinking it through and getting consensus and buy-in from our teams and having something we can point to where we said, this is what we agree, or this is what we agreed we're going to do, and how we're going to do it is invaluable. Another thing we want to do is make sure that we have a well-defined and agreed upon scope and timeline with our customers and stakeholders. And it doesn't have to be detailed scope, or it doesn't mean that we need to have a Gantt chart that we're not going to deviate from, but we want to get an agreement, a meeting of the minds on what we're going to deliver and when it will be done. I'm also a big fan of visualization tools. So we want to visualize the work. We should be creating roadmaps. We should be using Kanban boards or task boards, because it's easy for us to see the patterns that way. We also want to make sure that we're managing our risks, our actions, and our issues. Not very sexy, not very cool, but our risks and our actions and the issues are all those things, those small things that if we don't track them and resolve them, those are the things that are going to eat our lunch, and they do, and we see it happen. We want to simplify the process, and we want to empower the team. One of the articles I wrote about a year and a half ago was how do we build high-performing teams? And the three things I talked about was creating psychological safety, empowering the team, and simplifying the process. And I'm actually in the process of revisiting that and expanding it. If we make it difficult for our teams to execute, we will not have optimal processes. We also want to empower a team. We want to push decision-making down to the lowest responsible level in the organizations, because the people that are closest to the work know the best. And my experience is when we push decision-making up to the executive level, they don't make better decisions. They make decisions based on what people below them tell them, and no one wants to say no to the boss. So let the people that own it and are accountable for the work, let them be the ones making the decisions, because empowerment means we own the decisions and we're accountable for the outcomes. I also think that we should strive to create consistent, repeatable processes. We don't want rigid standards or templates, but we want to be able to execute and have something to improve upon. And that's how we get better. And that's how we're going to get better results. So again, the big takeaways: be pragmatic, recognize that pretty much all of our projects are hybrid these days, understand the patterns of practice, and therefore be intentional in terms of picking the practices and approaches and tools that we're going to use on our projects. And then finally, the bonus takeaway is we want to honor the craft. Project management, I don't care if it's agile, predictive, Scrum, or safe, it's not easy. If it was easy, then we would not all, we wouldn't have gray hair. We wouldn't complain about how hard it is. So honor what we do. Become learners, become lifelong learners, learn about different ways of doing things, and, share your successes with others in our community. If you want to contact me, I got really fancy now. You can scan the QR codes to read my articles. I've written over 140 articles on project management at this point, or connect with me on LinkedIn. And with that, any questions or comments?
Hello, Alan. This is Bharati Niti, and it was a wonderful session, Alan. I had a quick question, though. It is regarding that Nito Rodriguez model, right? You had mentioned about the scoring, right? Can you kindly elaborate on how the scoring is, what algorithm that is used for scoring mechanism, if you don't mind? Although I understand 1 is low, 3 is moderate, and 5 is high, I didn't know how the score came up in the right-hand side of the slide,
Oh, so there are the scores. Those are the ranges that he set. So you're going to score, and if you Google him, he did a big presentation. I think it was January 2024. It was a PMI webinar. And there's an article that he wrote that accompanied it. And so you're going to rate each of these items 1 through 5, tally up the scores, and then based on that, it's, this is what his recommended approach is for either the project or a stage or a component of the project.
Okay, thank you so much, Alan. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Alan. That was great presentation. At this time, we'll open the floor for questions. Anyone? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask question or put it in the chat, whatever works best for you.
Can I ask one more question?
You surely may.
Don't mind?
There's no
Really?
restriction.
Great, thank you. Alan, you mentioned all the projects. I mean, I know based on the understanding that we needed to go about it. From your experience, right, what is the biggest challenge organizations face in recognizing this inherent hybrid nature, especially when they are heavily invested in a single methodology like traditional waterfall or even strict Scrum network or Agile network,
Mhm.
that would be really a great help to know your thought process, please.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think there's a couple of challenges.
Yeah.
One is hybrid is not well defined.
Yeah.
And so when we, and one of the reasons that I say we need to go to this intentional approach with our project management is people feel like they know what a waterfall project looks like. People feel like they, we've got the Scrum guide. We know what Scrum looks like, even though most of us don't do it really all that well, to be honest. We're amongst friends. And so one is, what is hybrid? And if you start trying to parse through the literature out there, people start trying to describe hybrid as if it's this sort of clear monolithic approach. And I don't think I don't think it's accurate, but I think it also doesn't describe how most of us really actually execute our projects.
Okay.
So I think that, a challenge is what is it? And to then, if we recognize that we're in this hybrid world, it actually takes a lot more effort on our part as project managers, project leads, Scrum masters, Agile, whatever we want to call ourselves, because we need to be very intentional about describing the processes and practices that we want to use on this project in order to be successful.
Yeah. Is totally, it makes sense, it is, thank you so much, Alan. Appreciate
You're
it.
welcome.
Alan, I have a question. This is Aparna.
Hello,
So
Aparna.
when I was in commercial, certifications didn't matter much, right? PMP and all you had to be is very good at your job, and PMP was pretty much a certification that you could have, or even if you didn't, nobody asked. But that's a paradigm shift to GovCon, where certifications are very important. In fact, it's the yardstick for putting you or slotting you in a role. So what is your advice to stay relevant, both in commercial and federal spaces? Because you've seen both.
Right. I really think that, so let me address two parts to that. One is, in your role now in a GovCon, the certifications are important, and they're important from a just so that they can slot you on the projects where they're looking for specific skill sets. So it's important to get those certifications, but let's put that aside for a second. I think what's really important is that we as project managers, as agilists, really remain engaged, actively engaged in our broader communities. I listen to a ton of podcasts. I read a lot. I wish I had more time to go to more conferences, but project management, agile project management, they're still very much emerging and evolving fields. And there's lots of ideas out there, and some of them may be great, and some of them don't make any sense. But being exposed to them can help us, can help inform how we want to approach our work. Either like that's a great idea, or part of it's a great idea, or maybe that's the dumbest thing I ever heard of. But it gets us to think about what we're doing.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And even, like one of the podcasts, I mean, one of my favorite Agile podcasts is the Agile Uprising, and they're all over the place in terms of the things that they sometimes talk about, and I love it. Another one of my favorite podcasts is the Manage This podcast, which Velocity, which is one of my training partners, puts out. And there they're talking about folks that manage all sorts of projects, and projects that would never have anything to do with, I find to be awfully inspirational. Like there was an interview with this guy who went over to help after the Fukushima nuclear plant disaster, and getting his insights on how he approached that problem. Where there was another interview with the person that was the original project manager for building, oh God, what's the bridge in Baltimore that just got knocked down? The guy that built, was the PM for the original bridge. And it's like, wow, these are these huge projects that I've never done anything like that. And listening to them just gives me huge insights into other ways of thinking. Other questions or comments?
How do you see the role of experienced agile practitioners, Alan, evolving, as more and more organizations are planning to move towards these intentional hybrid modes, like about having background in IT and 10 plus in agile, SPC, RTE, how do you see them translate though?
So to me, and since I'm amongst friends, I will say this. I think that 10, 15 years ago, the Agile community did somewhat of a disservice to project management as an entire body, which is they were like, well, if you're, and I ran into this when I was at Fannie Mae. It was like, I had executives. It's like, well, project managers can't be Scrum Masters. It's like as if there's like some genetic predisposition. And I went through and I trained my entire team to be, to be Scrum Masters, and most of them did very well. And so I think that, rather than sort of creating this chasm and this labeling based on what our role is or what the certifications we have, we should think about these are sets of skills. And it's a matter of us figuring out what are the skills that I need to apply to the project that I'm working on. Yeah. And so, the things that we've learned as traditional project managers, a great foundation. The things that we learned as Scrum Masters help us understand, that iterative and incremental approach, how to be more servant leaders. And, for those of us that have been involved with SAFe or Scaled Agile, that provides a wonderful framework for thinking about how do we scale our Agile work from, a team or a small group to larger and larger efforts. So I think, these labels do us a disservice versus helping us.
Yeah, agreed, totally. Thank you, Alan, for your insightful comments. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. I thought I heard another voice popping in there as well. It sounded like a man's voice who had a...
No problems. Thanks, Alan, for the great talk, and I'm impressed to think about it. And you just pointed to the fact, hey, some people need these labels. Your role is whatsoever, and they are bound to, hey, I'm only a developer. I don't think about the project itself, and I wouldn't like to. Hey, how can we overcome these fixed labels and push the people into come in, help us, and think also in this team?
Good question. So I'm gonna. There's a video that I play in a lot of my different, particularly my Agile classes, and it's a short, I don't know, about 5-10 minute video of Jeff Sutherland talking about sort of how he developed Scrum and some of the things that influenced him. And one of the things that Sutherland said, and if you go back and you read the Scrum Guide, he said, we only have two named roles on the team. We've got the Scrum Master and the product owner. And that was because work that was done on high performing teams at Bell Labs found that the highest performing teams had the fewest number of named roles. And so when we start putting labels on ourselves and we say, well, I'm a developer, I'm a Java developer, I'm a Unix developer, I'm a DBA, all of a sudden we start thinking about, we start siloing ourselves, even if we're all on the same team. And so we really want to get people to not think about who they are in terms of what their role is, and that's their identification, but we're a team. And as a team, we are here to solve a problem. So I think that's part of it. And I think another important part to tag it back to what I was talking about earlier is, creating a clear what and why around what we're doing. And that why, when we describe the why of what we're doing, it should be inspirational, aspirational, motivational, and people should want to be part of that process. And that quite often then, some of that ego that we carry onto the project team hopefully will fade away.
Thank you, Ellen. Any other questions you have?
Yeah, Alan, really loved the conversation around high-performing teams and the thought of empowering these teams. Any advice for project managers or scrum masters, whatever the title be, where that is not seen as a practice and it's just do what you're told? How do we handle those situations?
So, I think that, if that's the situation you're in, the question I would have is, what is the source? What is the source of just do what you're told? And you need to then sort of work your way up and solve that problem. If it's you have a functional manager who's top-down command and control, what leverage or what influence do you have there? If it's you as the PM or the Scrum Master are the impediment, because let's face it, that's some of the traditional practices that we or the baggage we bring with us. How do we begin to solve it? And sometimes it's a matter of having a friend or a trusted advisor to tell us, what you're doing is not helpful for the team. Several years ago, a good friend of mine, someone that I've worked with earlier in my career, who owned a small software company here in Northern Virginia, asked me to sort of, coach his Scrum Master, or to coach his team, provide a little bit of guidance for his team. And one of the things he told me is, he said, we have these great meetings, we throw out all these wonderful ideas, but then we're a few minutes before the meeting ends, and I feel compelled to make the decision. And it frustrated him. Said, well, you own the company, you've set this pattern where you make all the decisions, so you just need to shut up. You either need to shut up or don't go to the meetings and let the team figure it out, because that's the pattern you've set. And we all have those kinds of things where we're doing things that we don't necessarily even realize if it's within our control. That makes sense, Pushkar?
Thanks. Yep.
Yeah. A book that I really love, and there's also a little YouTube video on it, is Turn This Ship Around by David Marquette. And the YouTube video, if you Googled David Marquette, QUET, and greatness, there's like about a 10-minute YouTube video. He talks about about leaders not making decisions and pushing that decision making down. And when we do that, we really can change the dynamic of our teams and our organizations.
Thank you, Ellen. It was the great presentation. I enjoyed it a lot, and I'm pretty sure everyone over here had a great time listening to the presentation. Thanks everyone for joining. And please tune up and sign up for our next upcoming session, which is August 7th. And the topic is AI Agile Evolution. It's like Agile delivery powered by AI. It will be co-presented by Toby and Ravi Balakudoti, who is AI transformation lead, and Toby, who is AI implementation lead. So please reserve your spot for our next session, which is August 7th. And thank you so much, Ellen, for the great presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. That was really
Bye.
informative. I appreciate
Thank you
it.
very much.
Thank you, Alan. Appreciate
You're-
it.
Thank
And
you,
hope to see
You're
you
welcome.
again.
Good to see you. Bye-bye. Thanks for having me.